the Minuteman Classroom, a series where we take a classroom-style approach to the basics so you have more time to spend in the field training with like-minded individuals from your community. This content is primarily inspired by Marine Corps doctrine and secondarily by Army doctrine, but may have been modified by the narrator in a way that they think best serves the tactical citizen and the modern Minuteman in order to set them up for success. None of this content is new or special, but is simply a rundown of the basics to get everyone on the same page. My name is Jeremy. I am a Marine Corps veteran, now full-time firefighter paramedic, and the owner of Everyday Citizens Tactical. And first, I was a field radio operator in the Marine Corps, which goes along with our topic of discussion for today, which is an introduction to radio frequencies and communications. During this today, we're going to talk about the different bands that make up radio communications. We're going to talk about some equipment, and then we're going to talk about some basic mannerisms when utilizing a radio. So let's get started. As an overview, these are the things we're going to talk about. I just went over those, so we're going to go ahead and skip through here again. So, as an introduction, communication is one of the most important aspects to any operation, and it is a never-ending process of adjustment, updates, and security. I can say from years and years of experience both in the military and then even into the first responder realm, even if it's not a technical communication related topic, comms is always updating and reshaping. Whether it's the equipment you use, whether it's the reporting formats that you use, whether it's when you use the communications equipment, so on and so forth. That stuff is always changing. And even when you're conducting an operation, whether that's a 2-day natural disaster, operation, or you're fighting off the paratrooping Chinese for 2 months straight, comms continues to update. You have to make sure that you're utilizing the correct comms. You may get into an area with some equipment and realize, hey, the challenges we face in this specific terrain, it's not best suited for what we came in here with. We're going to adjust from, this side of the frequency band to this side, or change the band altogether, so on and so forth. Or you may change comms windows and when you're going to actually talk on comms. You're going to change your encryption, whatever it might be. So that stuff is going to constantly change. Whether you're a citizen, whether you're a first responder, does not matter. The comms plan is always updating. Very basic required equipment at the user level is you're going to need some sort of transceiver with an antenna and a battery or a power source, depending on the type of radio that we are utilizing. Some sort of charging station if you're using a detachable battery. And then, while not completely necessary, a mic or a push-to-talk of some sort is definitely going to help you out. Even if you're just using a handheld radio, having some sort of speaker mic or push-to-talk system that goes to some type of over-the-ear communication system is going to be a huge benefit than constantly taking your radio in and out of the pouch on your kit to utilize it. And then a programming cable is also of good use. Even if you're not the comms person within your realm of community, it's also good to know how to do basic functions and do basic radio maintenance, even if you may not be the one doing all of that on a normal basis. I'm not advising anybody just plug in their radio to their computer and start messing around with all the settings, because whoever the comms guy is for your organization may be a little upset that you went and screwed up your radio. But get with them. If there's somebody in your organization that knows how to program and utilize the software for the radios that you guys use, and just try to develop that secondhand skill. You don't have to be a pro, but general familiarization is always great. And then a couple basic definitions. The radio frequency, this is a measurement representing the oscillation rate of electromagnetic radiation spectrum or electromagnetic radio waves. And then the transceiver is the radio. Most people don't call it a transceiver unless you work in the technical space, but just know if that you see that throughout any point in time in this presentation, the transceiver is the actual radio, the box, the actual electronics itself. So, what is HF, VHF, and UHF? At plain face value, this is the three main bands that we're referring to when we're talking about radio communications. There's all different types of sub-bands and bands beyond this and so on and so forth. Try to stick with me, guys, especially for my guys that are very comms savvy. You might find this to be entirely too basic and think I don't do it justice, but we're trying to keep everybody on the same playing field and get those guys that are not familiar with comms up to speed. So HF frequency is between 3 and 30 megahertz, and HF is predominantly used for much longer distance communication. I know some of the people that utilize CB radio may argue otherwise, but predominantly HF radio is used for longer distance communications, whether that be through voice or that be through digital modes, or what may commonly be referred to as data modes, utilizing some sort of computer device. HF is an extremely powerful tool, and I have some great graphics here in a second that you guys will be able to see. But HF can really talk all over the place. I was mind blown when I first got into the Marine Corps and was utilizing HF radios. Being on the West Coast in California, and we were doing little exercises, and we were talking to Marines that were in the field all the way in Japan and the Philippines and so on and so forth. HF is extremely, extremely powerful. However, I think it probably has one of the largest learning curves, especially on the digital side, just because there's so many different HF radios at this point that all have to be kind of set up in their own unique ways to utilize a lot of these computer softwares. So HF is kind of intimidating to get into, but it's definitely something that you should learn. It's a tool in the tool bag, specifically if you're trying to talk over a more regional base, or even wider than that, statewide base, or even bigger than that. HF is definitely going to be your friend. But there's going to be a lot of learning curves messing around with it, because it is probably the most affected by weather, solar patterns, so on and so forth. It can get quite tricky. Then we have VHF. This is one of the more common bands. Traditionally, it is 30 to 300 megahertz, but you'll see a lot of general civilian radios being utilized at 136 to 174 megahertz. And then there's also the low band side of VHF, which is very popular with military radios. And low band VHF is very good for kind of that intermediate line of sight, a little bit longer distance line of sight communications. Now, a lot of people don't know, but in the VHF band, you have the MERS frequencies. And the MERS frequencies are 5 frequencies that you're able to utilize without any type of license. It is great for just chatting with those in your area, or utilizing for training, so on and so forth. Now, one of the strengths of VHF is that it's very good in that kind of small suburban to more rural areas, with a little bit denser vegetation, some light rolling elevation. It can still very much be disturbed by great levels of elevation and changing levels of elevation, but generally speaking, in that more suburban to rural environment, it does very, very well. Now, if you go into the city, it does not like concrete and dense metal and everything else that you might find in that city environment. So, something to keep in mind when you're thinking about developing your communications plan and trying to figure out what type of equipment you need to utilize is, where is this communications equipment going to be utilized? Now, if you are starting in a more densely suburban area and your plan is to go somewhere very rural, well, you kind of need to make some concessions. You kind of need to think about your end goal more than your starting position, or make your communications plan more multi-tiered. But that's besides our point. Moving along to ultra high frequency UHF. This is 300 megahertz all the way to 3 gigahertz, and a lot more. This is a lot bigger of a frequency band for radios themselves. And this is where a lot of first responder traffic now kind of falls, not on the lower UHF band side, but in that 7, 8, 900 megahertz area. You'll find a lot of modern first responders are talking in there with all different types of trunking systems and repeaters tied in and so on and so forth. A little bit more complicated, but UHF still has a lot of usable space on the lower side that can be used by anybody. Of course, we have the GMRS and FRS frequencies that are available for use. Now, UHF is traditionally a little weaker over distance and not great in those rural environments. It's better suited for urban environments. It definitely does very well with kind of the concrete, metal buildings and all of that kind of stuff. However, there are some people that do swear up and down on UHF in more rural areas where it may be very rocky, kind of like the canyons, kind of out there in the lower southwest of the United States. A lot of people swear by UHF out there. UHF is also really good for directional, antennas. They UHF directional antennas are much smaller compared to VHF directional antennas and a lot more, portable. So they do have a lot of upsides with that. But just be very cautious, more so in this frequency band, about the potential of interfering with first responder communications. But the same thing may be an issue in VHF for more rural departments, maybe volunteer departments, stuff like that. So things to just keep in mind. This is a little chart that shows how the frequencies kind of travel as they travel throughout the band. And I don't think this does it justice because it's spread out so much. But as you can see, kind of starting on the left here, when we're in the HF band, the radio waves themselves are very, very spread out. Then as we move towards the center into VHF, they start to get a little more narrow until all the way we're on the right in UHF and beyond, where the radio waves are a lot more narrow than they are on the far left. So kind of an interesting chart. There's a lot of them out there. Some are better than this, but if you're more interested in how these radio waves actually travel and what they look like, this is there's a very good style of images to kind of paint those bigger pictures. So kind of going back to HF, there are two main topics main two thoughts for HF, and it is NVIS and DX. And as you can see, HF radio works by bouncing off of the ionosphere in our atmosphere. And this is why I said earlier that solar storms and all that kind of different stuff really plays a big part in how HF is going to perform. As you can see, NVIS, which there are charts out there as well that will kind of tell you which frequencies fall into which category, and it may even depend on the time of day. But these are the two categories we're looking at. NVIS, a little bit shorter distance communications, a lot more kind of narrow on that wave travel. There is definitely something that should be considered, and it is called the skip zone. That basically are the areas between you and where that radio wave finally comes back down and touches after bouncing off the ionosphere for the first time. The distance between you and that contact point is called the skip zone, and you're not going to be able to get HF communications in that skip zone. And that skip zone may be longer than what line of sight communications allows you to utilize without the aid of repeaters and stuff like that. So NVIS could be a little tricky if you're trying to talk too close. You're going to have to diversify your comms plans in other ways. And then DX, obviously a lot longer distance. If we're talking from continent to continent, or even one side of the United States to the other, this is where we are focusing at. Just another kind of graphic that highlights the skip zone with NVIS that I was talking about a minute ago. Everything bounces off of the ionosphere. And then lastly, how things interact with the ionosphere. This is why you see a lot of the satellites and then the space station and then spacecrafts themselves. They always utilize VHF and UHF frequencies. This is why they're able to pass through the layers of our atmosphere, whereas HF, this bounces off the ionosphere back down to Earth. So a couple of just interesting images to kind of paint the picture for everyone on how this kind of stuff works. So real quick, before we start getting into equipment, let's talk about analog versus digital. So analog radio works by picking up the audio signal from the transmission site along radio frequency waves known as carriers. This allows listeners to tune in to analog stations on FM or AM frequencies from home radios and car equipment. This is kind of where radio really started. This was all on the analog side, long before digital was a thing. Analog is completely open radio. It is not encrypted, anything like that. It is what we think of in just traditional radio. Now, some of the pros is that this equipment is normally more affordable and it's easier for beginners to understand. And it also has a continuous signal. What this means is that although your signal will weaken over time, that signal will continue to transmit until it either cannot anymore or it's lost into space. But the signal will travel. It will just kind of deteriorate. And it's probably the most commonly used out of the two of these, at least in the civilian aspect of talking. And then some of its cons is the transmission quality fades over distance. We talked about that. It does pick up a lot of interference, and then, of course, very unsecure. And then we have on the digital side. Digital radios work by picking up a processed signal which turns sound into patterns of digits, numbers, rather than the radio waves which are used for analog transmissions. Digital radio was originally created around for mainly first responders and military, and then obviously it makes its way to the civilian market. But digital radio itself is kind of a more secure tool to use over analog, because analog radio users cannot understand digital radios. They can hear it on their radios. If everybody is transmitting on 136 megahertz and the analog user hears digital, they're just going to hear a bunch of kind of static mumbo jumbo. It's not going to make any sense to you. Now, there's SDR equipment and everything you can utilize to process those signals, but at plain face value, digital is more secure on a normal basis than analog is. That does not mean it's secure, everyone. Let's not get that misconstrued. I'm just telling you that digital at plain face value is more secure than analog on analog equipment because it cannot be understood. But some of the pros is obviously more secure, less affected by interference. This is very true. Definitely a lot more feature capabilities, and there are encryption options. Now, some of the downsides to digital is it's more expensive, and this is very true depending on what side of the market you're trying to get into. We have P25 digital, and then we have DMR digital. Whether you're buying surplus gear, new gear, commercial gear, the range is very, very wide, and digital equipment is by far more expensive. There's a larger learning curve because of all of the features. As much of that is a pro, can definitely be a con as well. Uses more power than analog. It will eat up your batteries a little bit more, and it's not good over long distance. And what I'm saying is that it's not that it won't travel a long distance. It's that this signal will send with good quality until it doesn't anymore. It's not like analog where it will necessarily send at the same distance but just lose quality, if that makes sense to everybody. So you do have a better kind of reception and quality with the digital and the audio side, but it's not going to travel and fade the same way that analog will. So first types of radio, which are handhelds. These are lightweight and easily portable. Probably the most commonly used type of radio in the world, I would say, are handheld radios. And I think it goes without saying that there are hundreds, thousands of options for here, all the way from, pre-programmed little walkie-talkies from Walmart all the way to multi-$1,000, multi-band Motorola portable radios. These are traditionally limited at around 5 watts. If you buy some sort of Chinese knockoff or something like that, sometimes you can get them from all the way up to 8 or 10 watts. But traditionally speaking, portable radios are limited at 5 watts. And these will normally transmit in VHF or UHF, but there are some HF models out there as well. Then we have man packs. They're sometimes called portables, but not as often as like the handheld radios are. But man packs themselves, not as popular on the civilian market right now, but that is changing. But more so popular, obviously, on the military side. And these radios are normally transported in some sort of bag, much larger than handhelds, and they will have their own dedicated power source, just like a handheld radio would. That's just going to be much, much bigger. They can push anywhere from 20 to 50 watts of power. Normally, you're not going to see them push much more than that if it's a dedicated man pack radio, and even most military man packs are limited at 20 to 25 watts. These radios normally transmit on HF or VHF, UHF. It really just depends on the model that we're talking about and whether we're talking about military or we're talking about civilian manpacks, so on and so forth. Then we have mobile radios. These are radios normally fixed to a vehicle and they run off the vehicle's battery system. Not always, but normally, which normally means some sort of hardwiring and everything was done and it was installed to the actual vehicle itself. These can push a lot more power, 25 to 100 watts, maybe even more, and they should be matched with a quality antenna. Don't buy a multi-$100 mobile radio and push 100 watts on a $17 Amazon antenna. Could you do that? Sure, but it's not going to perform as well and probably even last as long as a good quality antenna that you match it with. And then once again, HF, VHF, or UHF frequencies. And then finally, base stations. These are the most powerful radios and are semi-permanently fixed to some sort of stand or power system. And these can push a lot of power, 50 to 250 watts, maybe even more. And they should be matched with a very sizable and quality antenna. This is where we're talking about some serious communications here. And just like, the mobiles, HF, VHF, or UHF, some are tri-bands, some are dedicated bands. It really, really depends. One thing I will hit on real quick from the mobile radio side that is not in here but probably should be is amplifier systems. Something that's extremely, extremely popular in the military with the PRIC 152 system is an amplifier in the vehicles themselves, and that'll take your 5-watt power output to 20-25 watt power output. So something to consider. There are some civilian market options. You just have to make sure that it's matched to the right band, and then whether it's analog or digital. Repeaters. These are retransmission devices used to increase the quality of area coverage, diversify communications plans, and increase transmission distance. A fun fact about repeaters is that the overwhelming majority of them are funded by private clubs and organizations. They are not most of your public repeaters are not, publicly funded by any means. There are, first responder and emergency repeaters all over the place. People don't realize how many first responder repeaters there truly is, especially in a more dense city. But, the most of the repeaters we think about when it comes to some sort of like ham radio repeater or maybe like a VHF repeater, anything like that, those are normally funded by clubs. So while you can get licensed and you are allowed to use them, if you're not licensed to use them and they're not open for use, don't utilize them just as a common courtesy unless it's an emergency, just because people do put their private funds and their own time and effort into building these things. We want to respect that. If we want them there and available to use during emergencies, that means during non-emergencies we need to respect that these private organizations are the ones building these. So a little bit of comms courtesy. There are field deployable versions that push kind of a lower power that serve as great temporary options. Some can be made in-house very easily, and then there are some commercial options as well. What's nice about the field deployable ones is obviously, one, they require a lot less power, but you can also kind of customize those a little bit more than you can the larger dedicated power output ones, just meaning that a lot of these are paired with some sort of handheld radio or handheld radios, and you're able to a little bit more affordably create a repeater with some higher capabilities. So something to look into for those of you that like projects. So general radio etiquette. Keep transmissions brief whenever possible. Use common terminology and lingo amongst users. Avoid transmission interference or interruptions unless it's an emergency. Think before you speak, and then speak slowly and clearly. This is something that kind of comes with time. A lot of people press, they're pushed to talk and immediately start speaking, or they didn't think about what they wanted to say, so then the first 3 or 4 seconds they're just kind of hot micing. So something that comes with time and something that comes with practice is talking on the radio itself, because talking on the radio starts extremely basic and almost robotic, and then works its way back towards just talking on the radio like a normal person talks. For whatever reason, and I'm guilty of it as well, when people start to utilize radios, they can't talk like a normal person. For whatever reason, your brain just does not do it as soon as you press that push to talk. You have to talk like a robot for anything to make sense. Otherwise, you sound kind of dumb. But after you do it for a while, everything becomes secondhand nature, and it kind of starts to come together a little bit easier. So some common phrases that you'll hear or may utilize on the radio is Roger, which just means to acknowledge, over, and out. These are two that get mixed up all the time or are used together. You never say over and out together. Over means I am done with the transmission and I am waiting for you to reply to my transmission. Out means I am done with my transmission and I'm done with this conversation. And we'll kind of see this in a minute here when we talk about how to do radio checks, good examples on how to utilize this. Break means I'm stopping this transmission, but I'm not done speaking. It basically is just kind of giving a break to either the person you are transmitting to and is copying information, or perhaps free up the radio for just a moment to see if anybody has any emergency traffic that may take precedence over yours. Stand by just means to wait. Wilco means will comply. Come in is just asking another station for acknowledgement. Say again means repeat what you just said. Anybody that was a military radio operator, normally you will not hear them ever say repeat on the radio. Not because of, we were always afraid that, in our current environments that we're worried that RD is going to, repeat a call for fire when we have no RD attached to us, but it's just stuck in our brain that we don't say repeat on the radio. And I think it is probably good practice if you're in the tactical setting trying to do any of this. Don't utilize repeat on the radio. And then copy, which is you understand. So, conducting radio checks. I don't know why this is always so hard for people, but for some reason it is. So, the following is an example of how a proper radio check should be done. So, we have Alpha 1 and Bravo 1 talking. As you can see, it's only 3 total transmissions, and that's plenty. So, Bravo 1, this is Alpha 1. Radio check. Over. Alpha 1, this is Bravo 1. I have you loud and clear. How me? Over. I have you loud and clear, Bravo 1. Out. Done. Just like that. Notice the use of over and out. So radio checks should be short and simple. While conducting such, you are checking for the strength of the transmission and then the quality of the audio during the transmission. So if the other station responds with Alpha 1, this is Bravo 1. I have you broken but readable. How me? Over. This means your transmission is full of interference or is weak, but they can still make out the transmission. And this is something that you should focus on when you're conducting these radio checks, because it is a note to both of the radio operators that if there's something not loud and clear about that radio traffic currently being conducted, that is something that needs to be noted for any type of operational purposes, knowing, hey, there's some sort of terrain or there's distance between us, whatever it is, something is disturbing perfect communications, and it's something that everybody should write down for their own notes. So some security considerations. Treat all radio transmissions as if someone may be listening, even if you're on P25 digital radio with AS256 encryption. Treat all radio transmissions as if someone may be listening. Do not use names or personally identifiable information on the radio. Rotate frequencies and encryptions regularly. Consider use of signal operating instructions or SOIs. SOIs are basically sheets that assign code words to other words or significant locations or operational significant notes that allow you to kind of old school encrypt basically what you're saying while utilizing the radios themselves. However, if an SOI sheet is compromised or maybe a radio is lost or compromised, that basically means that everything kind of needs to be reset. So there should always be backup plans on what you're going to do with communications, and then a plan on how you're going to roll everything over. Look at that. That's the next point. Have a secondary, tertiary communications plan, and then conduct gear accountability checks regularly during an operation to ensure no equipment was lost. if your patrol has been rucking it for about 30 minutes and you guys are taking that brief pause, if you're a team leader or a squad leader, doing, some sensitive items check is always good. Not just do I have my nods, do I have my rifle, does my rifle have its optic, but also look at your chest rig or whatever and be like, hey, do I still have my radio? Does my radio still have its antenna attached to it? So on and so forth. And then this is very big when you get back from any operation or your in between operations, doing a more thorough check of this equipment. And then also not just making sure that you have it, but that your radio is still programmed and it didn't drop encryption, anything like that. So direction finding. This is kind of the big bad boogeyman for a lot of people, and I think a lot of people don't fully understand how this works, or maybe how common or not common it is. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. And what we're going to talk about right here is kind of the field user side of direction finding. We're not talking about like KC-135s flying overhead that are geolocating you. If you have KC-135s that are geolocating you overhead, all of your comms is pretty much compromised. Don't even worry about it. But if it is not like that, and we're worried about direction finding from some sort of like signal intelligence unit in the field, whether they be mobile, whether they have drones, or whether they have an individual utilizing handheld equipment, this is what we're going to be talking about. So this is done by intercepting radio signals and measuring strength and direction to determine location of transmitters. Frequent transmissions and high power transmissions make it easier to complete direction finding. So if your patrol has some sort of internal radio frequency that they're utilizing to talk amongst the actual squad or platoon itself, and you guys aren't that far spread out, you can utilize low power or not utilize radios at all, and obviously very much negates the possibility of being direction find by the enemy. However, you can't just not use comms at all. There are some people who think you can get away with just not using comms at all because comms scary. You have to use comms in the world. You just have to know when to utilize it. If you are out on a patrol and you come to a patrol, some sort of stop in the patrol, whether it's planned at a checkpoint or you guys are just taking a quick breather, those are times that are good to actually push comms while you're at those locations, because the odds are you're not staying there very long and you're going to up and move. If you transmit once for 5 seconds while you're at a brief patrol base or just even a spot off of the road, and then you do it again in 30 seconds and then one more time another 30 seconds from that's it, you're not really exposing a whole lot. However, if you on your 15-minute patrol break just sit there and chatter every 15 seconds on high power for that entire break, you're going to expose yourselves quite a bit. So kind of use some common sense when it comes to this kind of stuff. And this could be defeated obviously with tight communications windows, rotating locations, and controlled power usage. Just use some common sense with this, guys. Every time you utilize your radio, the enemy is not going to know where you are, and you're just going to get instantly obliterated by drones or artillery fire. However, if you're not utilizing, proper SOPs and you're just being a chatterpants on your radio, you're going to increase the chance of that, very much. You should also know from an intelligence perspective whether whoever that enemy may be, do they even have the capabilities to direction find? Because if you're just constantly freaking out about direction finding, and that capability isn't even in the conversation, or at least isn't even in a unit dedicated to your AO, you can kind of loosen up a little bit. You can't get completely relaxed, but you can loosen up a little bit. So intelligence does matter while driving home a lot of this. So this is a kind of little very basic example of how direction finding may work. Obviously, in the center of the town there, we see a red building. We're just going to think that is the enemy position that we are trying to figure out where it's at, direction finding. And I have a signal intelligence team at location A and location B. And they are, scanning areas for any type of radio signal. And location A gets a hit on azimuth. Let's just take a guess and say, 35 on azimuth 35. So then they draw a line on their map and say, hey, this is where we detected a signal, from our location. So then we draw that, boom. And then location B says, hey, I got something at 330. So then they draw a line on their map, boom. And now you have that kind of cross-reference area, and there you can kind of narrow things down. Like, okay, this is where that that radio signal is coming from. This can be done with multiple signal intelligence teams with handheld equipment. If you're a little bit more fancy, this can be done with drones that just circle a location. This can also be done with vehicles that take different patterns and collect signals. So something to consider in the radio direction finding kind of topic of conversation. I don't think it's quite the boogeyman that a lot of people think it is, but it's definitely something that should be taken very seriously. And as a general rule of thumb, guys, not everybody needs a radio, not everybody needs to talk on the radio. So make sure you're practicing with your radios, but not practicing where you're only dependent on radios. Kind of a double-edged sword there, guys. So, if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section down below. Take it easy on me for my guys that are a lot more comm savvy. I'm sure some people are going to be frustrated with the elementary kind of way that a lot of this was explained, or that some things didn't go into certain detail. But again, we're trying to address the kind of basic or newer user to communications and get them brought up to speed a little bit more on some of the more basic topics within the field of thought. So that's all I've got, guys, for that introduction to comms. If you have anything else you guys want to see, topics on, there's a lot of stuff coming down the pipeline. An episode's trying to come out at least every few weeks, I'm hoping. But if there's stuff you want to see specifically, leave it in the comments and I'll add it to the list as far as creating content. Other than that, guys, train hard, train often.